Good afternoon. My name is Rolf Diamant, and I have the great pleasure this afternoon of introducing our next author, Rick Winston, who will talk about his new book, just out. I just got it from the Yankee bookstore yesterday. Red Scare in the Green Mountains, the McCarthy Era in Vermont, 1946 to 1960. Before we get started, it's important to point out that BOOKSTOCK, and you may have heard this before, but I will re-emphasize it for all. This is only possible because of the volunteer work of people throughout our communities and your generosity. BOOKSTOCK is supported by a handful of organizations who really stepped up. And I think we have to reach out and recognize their contributions. The Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, the Pauline Davenport Children's Fund, the Vermont Community Foundation, the Skoma Savings Bank, the Vermont Humanities Council, the Green Mountain Foundation, the Woodstock Learning Lab, and the Economic Development Commission of Woodstock, Vermont. And a special thanks to our media sponsor, the Vermont Standard, and to WCTV8, Woodstock Community Television, who is taping this event this afternoon. And the very oldest independent bookstore in Vermont, the Yankee Bookshop. And the Yankee Bookshop, raise your hand, will be selling copies of Rick's book, and he will be signing them directly after this presentation. A reminder, of course, that we do operate on grants, your generosity, and donations. So if you can, please drop something in the donation containers as you leave the room. And Jenny, there's somewhere back.
Actually, we don't have one here, but there's plenty of opportunities to give at the other side.
Great.
Yeah, on the green is the great giving opportunity.
All right, you've heard it from Allison. Okay. I just will introduce Rick with a few words. Earlier this summer, I attended a performance in Barnard, up the road, of a play entitled "It Can't Happen Here." You know, many of you are familiar with it, based on the book of the same title, written in 1938 by Sinclair Lewis, who was then residing in Barnard. In fact, it was only a decade later, and maybe even before, that this very proposition was put to the test concerning the resiliency of American democracy here in Vermont as it was elsewhere across the United States. Fast forward 50 years later, and this conversation has once again returned to the forefront of our everyday consciousness. Rick is a native of Yonkers, New York. He attended both Columbia University and the University of California, Berkeley. He arrived in Vermont in 1970, and he still lives here, co-founding the Savoy Theater, which became a mecca in Montpelier for the lovers of all sorts of independent films. And he still teaches film hit topics and film history, and presents on such topics throughout Vermont and beyond, including the Hollywood Blacklist. And I might add that he has done many presentations for the Vermont Humanities Council, which is deeply appreciated. Both his parents were New Yorkers and were affected during the McCarthy years. And this long-standing interest in that area has led him to be one of the organizers back in 1988 of a very thoughtful conference that was held in Montpelier on the subject of Vermont in the McCarthy Era. Rick will outline several episodes explored in his book and illustrated throughout with newspaper headlines and photos There will be some time at the very end of his presentation for questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Rick Winston.
Thank you, Ralph. People use the term McCarthy Era and Red Scare sometimes interchangeably. I have come to really appreciate the term Red Scare better for two reasons. One, it's more emotionally evocative of the fear and hysteria of the time. And the other reason is that McCarthy's time on the stage was relatively brief as we look back, 1950 to 1954. My book starts in 1946, ends in 1960. What we think of the McCarthy era started before him, ended after him, and in some ways it hasn't ended yet. As Ralph said, my interest in this area really grew out of the experiences of my parents, who were both New York City school teachers and both threatened with the loss of their livelihoods during this period. They were, in Philip Roth's very eloquent phrase, talking about the McCarthy era, they were impaled on their moment in history. That is, they found out that organizations they had belonged to 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, were coming back to threaten their future as teachers. It wasn't until I was a teenager years later and a young adult that I realized the extent to which the McCarthy era was kind of a backdrop in my growing up as a child of the 50s, and how it affected the decisions that my parents made as a family. And when I got to Vermont, fresh out of college, I sort of said, well, wonder what happened here. It just kind of percolated in my mind. Then I met two other people who were similarly interested. Maybe you know them, Richard Hathaway, who taught at Vermont College for many years, and Michael Sherman, the former director of the Vermont Historical Society. So the three of us organized the conference in June 1988. And many of the panels and the speakers, subsequently, they became the focus of this book. And for instance, the Vermont farmer is the China expert William Hinton from Putney. And there's a chapter on William Hinton and the Putney School. Out of many things that he was, Vermont farmer was kind of down on the list, but that made a good headline.
Is that his sister Joan? It's
Joan,
Yeah, we
yeah.
know her. Oh, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Another chapter in the book will be about Senator Flanders and his takedown of McCarthy, the odious Roy Cohn, sitting in the middle of Donald Trump's mentor. Another chapter is on Vermont's only high-profile academic firing, Professor Alex Novikov at UVM. And it's an incredible story about Vermont institutions and how the institutions reacted to the threats at that time. And chapter 2 is about the unsuccessful 1948 presidential campaign of Henry Wallace. And he was viciously attacked by two conservative papers out of Burlington. But, you know, I came back to a headline that we didn't have time to explore at the conference. And I went back and I saw the headline. I said, oh, what was that about anyway? And that was kind of the germ of this book that became the first chapter that I wrote. So I'll read some from chapter 3, which is called A Sinister Poison, The Red Scare Comes to Bethel. In the first sentence, perhaps maybe somebody can answer the question I pose. I say, here's a question to stump many history buffs. Who was Ordway Mabson Southard? Anybody know? All right. He read the book, so he knows the answer. A May 20, 2001 obituary for this prolific poet and haiku specialist noted some of the places that he had lived: Alaska, Mexico, Alabama, Hawaii, and British Columbia, but no mention of Vermont. Yet it was here in the summer of 1950 that the Southards, Ordway Southard and his wife Mary, set off a chain of events that thrust Vermont into the national news. Only a passing obituary reference to their political activities, both were highly influenced by Marxist socialist thought and participated in the civil rights movement, gives a clue to the incident that led to headlines such as this. This is from the Bradford Opinion. The events of that summer demonstrated that Vermont was fully vulnerable to the national fear and suspicion that marked this period. Two of the most public and persistent critics of this Red Scare were newspapermen, and each played a vital role in diffusing this controversial episode. Robert Mitchell, publisher and editor of the Rutland Herald. He became its editor-publisher in 1948. And John Drysdale, who had published the White River Valley Herald and Bradford Opinion since 1945. In 1991, Drysdale was inducted into the Community Newspaper Hall of Fame with the citation noting his role discrediting claims that Bethel and Randolph were a hotbed of communism. So they were two of the several major figures involved in this controversy, which also featured a Tibetan Buddhist dignitary, a local self-described red hunter, and two well-traveled, prolific authors who, unlike Ordway Southard, were nationally prominent: the Far East expert Owen Lattimore and the Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson. The story begins with Stefansson, who first came to Bethel in 1941. By then he was a renowned veteran of several Arctic expeditions beginning in 1906, and later author of several landmark books about the Far North. He was born in Winnipeg to Icelandic immigrant parents, grew up in rural North Dakota, and was encouraged by a professor mentor of his at Harvard to master the field without the trappings of academia. This is a big deal in 1915 or so. Stefansson soon started his travels without having completed his degree. The Icelandic author Halldór Laxness described Stefansson as a poetry-loving academic who gets up from his writing desk, wipes the ink off his fingers, and becomes an Eskimo in order to expand the boundaries of science to include the nations of the Arctic. During the 20s and 30s, he was based in New York City and amassed an extensive research library open to students of the Arctic. But he had a lot of difficulty adjusting to the sweltering summers of New York, and the advice of his secretary, who summered in Gaysville, Vermont, not too far from here, he started looking for property in the state. Shortly after his marriage to Evelyn Baird, he bought the Deering Place, a farmhouse and land in Bethel, small town about 20 miles south of the state capital, Montpelier. During their time in Bethel, which was often as long as 5 months of the year, the couple was active in the life of the town, with Stefansson addressing various club meetings and Evelyn singing in the church choir. After Stefansson learned that an adjoining property known as the Stoddard Place was to be logged, he convinced his old first mate on his expeditions to buy it. But Vermont did not suit this old mate, and Stefansson bought the property back. In 1947, he and Evelyn invited their good friends, Owen and Eleanor Lattimore, to stay for the summer, and during that time, they made plans for the Stoddard Place to become a summer center of Asiatic studies. Owen Lattimore was born in Washington, D.C. in 1900. Shortly afterward, his father moved the family to Shanghai, China, to take a teaching position. By the time the younger Lattimore was in his 20s, he had traveled widely in China and was a fluent Chinese speaker. On his honeymoon in 1925, he and his wife Eleanor, who became his major collaborator, traveled across China and Mongolia, where he formed a deep connection with the Mongol people and empathy for their autonomy struggles. Among their close friends was what was known as a living Buddha, somewhat akin to a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. He was known as the Dilawa Hutuktu, who would play a role in Latimore's stay in Vermont years later. In 1937, Lattimore became a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and by the start of World War II is widely regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on Central Asia. In 1940, President Roosevelt appointed him to be personal emissary to Chiang Kai-shek, a post he held until his appointment in 1942 to head the Pacific operations of the Office of War Information. During this period, he lectured, wrote, edited Pacific Affairs, the influential magazine of the Institute for Pacific Relations. Lattimore and Stephenson met at an annual meeting of the American Philosophical Society during Lattimore's first year at Johns Hopkins and quickly became close friends. Their wives bonded also, and Stephenson's wife Evelyn recalled later the special kind of dialogue that Owen and Steph had when conditions were right. She said, "These two exceptional men, each expert in his chosen field and interested in everything that related to it directly or peripherally, would begin a conversation. In comparing Eskimo and Mongol ways, no detail was too small to be recited, and followed by evaluation, comparison, and speculation." Speaking of remarkable people, I found out that Evelyn Stephenson was quite an amazing person in her own right. She met Stephenson in New York in the 30s. She had been an actress and a puppeteer. Her first husband was Bill Baird of the famous Baird marionettes. And she had become Stephenson's assistant. They fell in love, and despite a 30-year age difference, had a long and happy marriage. By the time these four friends developed the idea of the Summer Center in Bethel, the post-war political landscape was undergoing a severe change. An increasing fear of communism and a suspicion of heretical ideas about foreign policy. The FBI started files on both Stephenson and Lattimore long before Senator McCarthy came on the scene. In Lattimore's case, his support for the Maryland Civil Liberties Committee in 1941 was enough to get a file started. As Ellen Schrecker, who is a noted historian on this period, as Ellen Schrecker has noted, had observers known in the 1950s what they have learned in the 1970s, I'm taking your name down. So as Ellen Schrecker commented, had observers known in the 1950s what they have learned since the 70s when Freedom of Information Act was passed, McCarthyism would probably be called Hooverism, in reference to the longtime director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, some historians say, when you talk about the Red Scare, some historians say, are you talking about the first one or the second one? And J. Edgar Hoover had a part in the first one. The first Red Scare.
Oh my God. Why did you just into the FBI con?
It's Hoover. Sorry. Hoover hovering.
Anyway, J. Edgar Hoover was a young agent at the time of the first Red Scare, which immediately followed the Russian Revolution and in that period where they were deporting dangerous people like Emma Goldman. Anyway, in the 1940s, Stephenson, like many anthropologists, was already under FBI suspicion for the causes he supported. The fact that he was about to undertake his long-planned Encyclopedia Arctica with the active assistance of Soviet experts on the Arctic only heightened his profile. Stephenson's offer to the Boy Scouts to use his farm for Arctic camping lessons led to a sensational January 1948 in the William Randolph Hearst-controlled New York Journal American. In that article, he was identified as belonging to 76 different Communist Front organizations. The Boy Scouts subsequently rejected his offer for the protection of the Boy Scouts of America from possible public criticism. Lattimore's FBI file had been deactivated during the war, but by 1949, previously discredited witnesses were getting a second hearing from the FBI, and the file was reopened. As the turmoil in China increased, Lattimore began speaking publicly about his disenchantment with Chiang Kai-shek, urging American policymakers to adjust to the possibility of an eventual victory by Mao Zedong's communist insurgency, and arguing that Mao was not necessarily a pawn of the Russian communists. His strong opinions, forcibly expressed, made him powerful enemies, especially those on the right, looking for scapegoats for the, quote, loss of China. In May 1949, both Lattimore and Stephenson appeared on a list of 102 speakers and entertainers judged by the American Legion for unsuitable for Legion sponsorship. They were only among a handful of academics on a list that included Lena Horne, Paul Robeson, Lillian Hellman, Burl Ives, and Gene Kelly. So Lattimore and Stephenson continued to communicate during the winter about the plans for their Asiatic Studies Center, and Lattimore proposed bringing some Mongolian exiles, and Lattimore's son David enlisted some of his Harvard classmates to help with the renovations. The arrival of the Mongolians, including Lattimore's old friend, the Dillawa, was a source of excitement for the town of Bethel that summer. A front-page article in the White River Valley Herald said, "Buddhist high dignitary here for summer on Bethel Farm," reported the Dillawa was dressed in a long Chinese gown. His bearing is very dignified and serene. He speaks no English except for a few simple phrases. An editorial on the following page noted, "The White River Valley is proud to welcome a living Buddha. We are sure that the dignified bearing of the Dillawa will be strengthened by his summer's communion in the Green Mountains." Neither Stephenson nor Lattimore was aware of the FBI's intense interest during the busy summer of 1949. The FBI took note of the Dillawa's presence and went as far as arranging the Bethel postmaster to intercept Lattimore's mail. That was the best they could do, since the isolation of the two farms presented no easy cover for personal reconnaissance. The enthusiastic agent assigned to the case, A. Cornelius, from the Albany office, read mail, he listened to phone recordings, and he sent photographs of letters, some in Chinese and Mongol, to Washington for translation. Hundreds of copied letters to and from Lattimore ultimately wound up in the FBI files. Agent Cornelius decided also to read up on Buddhism so that he could better understand what was taking place. The theory he advanced was that Lattimore might be preparing the Dillawa to be the communist figurehead in Tibet. In fact, Lattimore was working diligently with his networks of contacts in Asia to save rare Tibetan cultural manuscripts from the Chinese communists. As Lattimore had written that February to a friend, Tibet is clearly doomed to come under the control of the Chinese communists. There is, however, time for a planned salvage operation. By late September, the Lattimores and their Mongol friends were back in Baltimore. During the winter of 1949 and 50, further developments chilled the political landscape. Most significantly, the conviction of Alger Hiss, that's Stephenson and the Dillawa. There's Alger Hiss testifying. Hiss had denied being part of a secret communist group in the State Department, and his conviction for perjury emboldened bittered ex-communist informants, political enemies of Lattimore, and unscrupulous politicians like Senator Joseph McCarthy. In February 1950, McCarthy made his first major headlines when in a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he claimed to have the name of 205 communists in the State Department. Actually, the 205 figure was in the press release that went out to newspaper people. In the actual speech, he changed that number to 57 and kept changing it as the weeks went on. Throughout February and March, McCarthy stayed in the headlines, promising to name the mastermind of this conspiracy. In March 1950, while Lattimore was on a UN-sponsored economic mission to Afghanistan, McCarthy charged with great fanfare that Lattimore was in reality the highest placed Soviet spy in the State Department. Despite McCarthy's haphazard methods, he had what Lattimore's biographer Robert Newman called a brilliant sense of timing and a sure instinct for what an uncritical press and a disillusioned public would buy. Lattimore and his many supporters quickly dismissed McCarthy's charges as outlandish. Lattimore's telegram to the press, sent as he hastened home to face the charges, read in part, "McCarthy's off-record ranting is moonshine. Delighted his whole case rests on me, as this means he will fall flat on his face." As Evelyn Stephenson wrote in her own memoir, "Could this be happening in the United States? This felt like a Kafka novel in which unimaginable, terrifying nightmares occurred. Our scholarly friend Owen, the man who loved the Mongols and their culture as much as Steph loved the Inuit. If it had not been so scary, it might have been funny." McCarthy quickly backpedaled when it came time to address the full Senate, downgrading Lattimore to somebody who had, quote, tremendous power in the State Department as the architect of Far Eastern policy. But the damage had been done to Lattimore's reputation. It was easy to prove that Lattimore had never even been a State Department employee, and by 1950, July, he was cleared of McCarthy's charges by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but not before amassing significant legal fees. He was represented by future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas. It became sadly clear to the Lattimores that they would have to sell their half share in Stephenson's farm, and Stephenson agreed to help by placing an ad in his own name in the Saturday Review of Literature. The only person who answered the ad was Ordway Mabson Southard, a former anthropology student at the University of Alaska and a longtime admirer of Stephenson's. Southard had done some research in Stephenson's New York library a few years earlier and had helped move some of the books and furniture to Vermont. He saw the ad and quickly saw an opportunity to have further contact with one of his idols. On June 14th of 1950, the sale was completed. Stephenson wrote to Lattimore just after the sale that he had heard through the winter that Southard was a communist. But, as Stephenson said, my clippings bureau was sending me cuttings saying that I was a communist. To me, this sort of thing was Salem witchcraft all over again, and I perhaps leaned over backwards not to appear to be afflicted with what was increasingly worrying me as mob hysteria. Stephenson astutely went on to warn Lattimore that selling the Stoddard farm to a, quote, communist might be used against Lattimore. Lattimore did look into canceling the sale, but Abe Fortas advised him against it because there was a valid contract. Evelyn Stephenson did not trust Southard, and her fears were realized because what Southard did not tell Stephenson before the sale was that he and his wife Mary had been Communist Party organizers and were still party members. Further, while in Alabama organizing steel mill workers, Ordway Southard had run for governor on the Communist Party ticket in 1942. And Mary Southard ran for state senator as a communist that same year. So the FBI was not alone in watching the Lattimores and the Stephensons. The Southard past merely might have been an inconvenience for the Stephensons, if not for the intention of a local Bethel woman named Lucille Miller, who is known in the area for her extreme anti-communist views. She wrote frequent letters to prominent conservative syndicated columnists like Fulton Lewis Jr. and Westbrook Pegler, and often sent ideas for investigative articles to the Hearst newspaper chain, especially the locally connected Boston Evening Record. The influential Pegler quoted Miller in a 1950 column titled, "Vermont Yankees are suckers for commies." The article went on to attack Vermont author Dorothy Canfield Fisher, Vermont Life editor Arthur Peach, and another one of Lucille Miller's targets was a group of government officials who were friends of Alger Hiss, who all had homes in the Randolph Center area, especially Lee Pressman, who was the former lead counsel for the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. So the Boston Evening Reporter finally took up Lucille Miller's invitation to see for himself what was happening in Bethel and Randolph Center. And within a week, this headline was in the papers all over the country. So McCarthy was charging that the land sale was being used to boost the communist coffers. So we don't have time for the rest of the chapter, which shows how the local newspaper editor, John Drysdale, together with his friend Robert Mitchell, did what they could to beat this story back. And the controversy actually was diffused within a month. So I go into that story just with a, they hired an investigative reporter. They hired an investigative reporter from New York to come up and do 6 stories, one each day for a week, that would run in both the Rutland Herald and the Brattleboro Reformer. And the story of the whole land sale and Lucille Miller's crazy ideas. It all was played out on the front pages of Vermont newspapers. Anyway, I'll be happy to answer questions about this chapter, about the era in general, what the rest of the book is about.
Why in the 1950s were people so disillusioned after World War II and a strong economy, a lot of growth?
Well, you know, the book starts in 1946, is the first chapter that I do, and it has a lot to do with the collapse of the USSR alliance that was so strong during the war. As soon as Roosevelt died, Truman and Truman's advisors took a very hard line against the Soviet Union. And there were people who would postulate that, you know, that we needed for the Defense Department needed an enemy. And this, you know, as I say in another part of the book, the Red Scare, you know, in a manner of speaking, has been going on as long as there have been Reds. So it was this was a current that was flowed through all of 20th century American politics. And we have to also remember, this was a very, this is one of the theories of my father, which I've come to subscribe to, is that a lot of the anti-communist threat was a smokescreen to destroy the strength of labor unions, which were gaining incredible strength towards the end of the war. Yeah, Taft-Hartley Act right after the war, you know.
Wasn't the appeal of the Communist Party was sort of like the only game in town if you were opposed to the way African Americans were treated? Because that was my understanding, that like if you were equality-minded, that was the only organization that supported your...
If you were interested in racial justice, they were doing the only organizing. I read a wonderful book a few years ago about Jackie Robinson and his signing with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and it followed The Daily Worker was the only paper that was in favor of Major League Baseball integration until a certain time had passed. So, yeah, you know, if you were, especially if you were the child of immigrants, the Depression, which seemed to prove to a lot of people that capitalism was not working, a lot of people just, in their idealism, drifted to the Communist Party. Many of them got disillusioned after it became apparent what Stalin was actually doing, but by then it was too late. And then the question came for them, if I am investigated, am I going to name my friends? Because it became what one writer called a ritual of public humiliation. The only way you could prove you're a patriot is by giving them names that they had already. Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess there must have been a lot of less famous people that were affected somehow.
Oh, less famous. You
Than-
like my
than-
parents.
His parents.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, this really, people in academia all over lost their jobs. People at a lower level in the US government, if you worked for the Bureau of Statistics, you know, and in 1947, President Truman, under pressure from the right-wing Republicans that he wasn't hard enough on communism, he was the one who came up with the loyalty program where people who were working for the government had to sign a loyalty oath. And
I was just going to say, but this reminds me a lot of my whole last 40 years of life, where I was working with people who were indicted and persecuted by McCarthyism in the early 50s. Most of them died now, but I was in a U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, which was started by a lot of left-wing, not really communists, just people who were always fellow travelers interested in China, met Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, had this whole history. And Joan Hinton and Bill Hinton were members of the U.S.-China. John Service, who was thrown out of the state. All of these people, and a lot of little people, friends of mine who were writers and journalists who had gone to China, came back, were not communists, but they were very sympathetic to what was going on. Harrison Salisbury, who was not a communist, but was very sympathetic as well. Everybody knows him, Siege of Leningrad. But all of these people were persecuted. They lost their jobs. One friend of mine had to start running a laundromat, and that was his livelihood for like 10 or 12 years. So just saying, there was a lot of little people who were not on big movers and shakers who were affected by this, by the Red Scare. What I don't understand is, and I think a lot of this was tied to China and to the rise of Chairman Mao and the fall of Chiang Kai-shek, the loss of China. They were seeing that because Russia was rising as well. So you had the rise of Red China as two Goliaths. You know, how's the U.S. going to be able to handle this? Because half the world now is communist. Anyway, it's a very tragic era. And I worry about it now because I'm implicated. FBI has come to see me on many occasions in the past because we had Chinese people in our home in the 80s and the 90s who were friends of ours who we met through the China group. So I've never been persecuted, but never lost my job. So things have changed to a degree, but if it comes back, you know, it makes me worry what could happen. Now I'm past my career, so I don't worry as much. And I'm in Vermont, which I think, and I went to Carolina, which was considered a hotbed of communism. So it really is amazing.
Yeah, there's one theory that is a pretty strong one, I think, that part of the reason that the United States got involved in Vietnam was that people like John Service, who had been thrown out of the State Department because they brought some rational ideas about dealing with Mao Zedong, they were out and there was nobody to really, Anyway.
Well, we ought to take one more question.
Yeah. So given the somewhat secretive FISA court, the clearly untransparent CIA and FBI. What parallels can you draw between, because I wasn't alive to, or I wasn't, to see Hoover in action, but and Comey sort of been vilified by left and right. What parallels can you draw between Comey and Hoover?
Comey is a very strange figure, because as somebody said, he believes ultimately in Comey and his own righteousness. So he was saying, I'm not going to take a position on what Trump and Putin are doing, about affecting the next election. I shouldn't be doing that. Well, you already did it, So I think there are too many threads to wrap up very quickly. But it's very interesting to look at the parallels between them and now, and how I have friends who say, I can't believe that I'm supporting the FBI after a lifetime of vilifying them, that they were taking your name wherever you went. They may still be.
Rick, thank you very much.
Thank you.